everyone. Welcome back to Visualizing Abolition. Today featuring Kēhaulani, Kauanui, Sadie Barnette, Zoe Samudzi, and Eric Stanley. I'm Rachel Nelson, Director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences at UC University of California, Santa Cruz. Today's discussion is part of a longer series coordinated with Gina Dent on art, prisons, and abolition, created in partnership with the San Jose Museum of Art and the Mary Porter Cezanne Art Gallery. We have events almost every week, and you can find the previous Visualizing Abolition archives and information about upcoming events at barringfreedom.org. Additionally, on the website are all the music videos created for Music for Abolition, curated by Terry Lynn Carrington. The video for today, which will premiere at the end of the event, is by Elena and Samora Pinderhughes. Information about the related art exhibition, Barring Freedom at San Jose Museum of Art, open through April 25th, can also be found at barringfreedom.org. I hope many of you get to see the exhibition before it closes in a couple weeks. San Jose Museum of Art has been generous enough to offer free admission to people who attend events, and we'll put the code in the chat so that you can take advantage. All of our efforts aim to highlight the different strategies contemporary artists, musicians, activists, and scholars use to expose publics to the histories and structures that undergird prisons and policing, as well as those which can lead us to collectively imagine other social relations beyond the oppressive systems of the present. We've been particularly looking forward to this conversation with this amazing group of artists and thinkers who can help us think about the relationship of the prison to the nation. Over the course of the talks thus far in the series, it's been clear that prisons and policing have been central in the construction of the United States. As we've heard, they've played an immense role in the historic and continued settler politics of indigenous expropriation, as Kelly Lytle Hernandez and Joanne Barker reminded us, and racist labor politics and histories, which Brian Stevenson, Sonia Clark, and others so eloquently spoke of, and our intimate social relations that many speakers, including Beth Ritchie and Erica Miners, addressed. Today, I'm happy that we get to dive deeper into the questions raised by this pernicious entwining of prisons and the state. I'll introduce our guests very briefly, which is hard to do with all their accomplishments, and note that I do make sure to point out that 2 of them are UC Santa Cruz alumni. Then I'll turn it over to them to get the conversation started. So you can join me now, everyone. First, Sadie Barnette is one of the artists whose works we've had the honor of featuring in Barring Freedom. Her work has been exhibited throughout the United States and internationally, and is in the permanent collection of museums such as LACMA, Berkeley Art Museum, the California African American Museum, Studio Museum in Harlem, Brooklyn Museum, and the Guggenheim. Kēhaulani Kauanui is Professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in anthropology at Wesleyan University. Kēhaulani earned her doctorate in history of consciousness at UC Santa Cruz. She's the author of Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, among other books, edited volumes, and essays. Eric Stanley is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. They're the author of the Just Out and much anticipated Atmospheres of Violence, Trans Queer Antagonism, and the Ungovernable, and the co-editor of multiple books, including Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment, and the Prison Industrial Complex. They also earned their PhD in the history of consciousness. Finally, Zoe Samudzi's research engages colonial biomedicine, visuality, German colonialism, and the 1904 to 1908 genocide in present-day Namibia. Her writing has appeared in The New Inquiry, The New Republic, Art in America, and other publications, and she's contributing writer at Jewish Current. Along with William Anderson, she's the co-author of Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Our Liberation. She's also a doctoral candidate in medical sociology at University of California, San Francisco. Thank you all so much for this. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'll turn it over to you, Sally.
Good evening, not good morning, goodness. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be in conversation with this group of creatives, artists, scholars, who've all really informed my own thoughts about abolition and anarchy and the state in really important ways, and who remind me that anarchy and abolition are as much invitations for life making and for joy and for world building and for imagination as it is about destroying the state and destroying hierarchies and destroying systems of oppression. Although I'd met her once before, I saw Kēhaulani for the second time in Honolulu at the American Studies Association conference in 2019. And she had gifted me 2 of her books about Hawaiian sovereignty and indigeneity. And it was really, moving is the wrong word. It doesn't kind of encompass the magnitude of applying all the things that she'd written about coloniality and the military occupation of the islands, and seeing them firsthand was really overwhelming and really forced me to think about what it means to be, you know, a Black woman of Zimbabwean descent and to be in solidarity with Indigenous people all over the world, including peoples whose sovereignties are being undermined by the American government. Eric's co-edited book, Captive Genders, was actually one of the formative texts in my anarchist education. And I encountered it for the very first time at my very first ever anarchist book fair in Oakland in 2015. And while at the time I was doing work on trans health, I was working for the Center of Excellence for Trans Health, it was the first book that I had ever read that really connected medical structures to the prison industrial complex, to the carceral system. And it forced me to be so much more critical about how I think about medicine. It's not just this place we go to be treated. It is also a place, or it is the site of discipline. It is the site of violence. And yeah, can't say enough about their work. I'm a huge stan of Sadie. I've had the honor of writing about her work before, about the way that she carefully archives, about the way that, you know, she's a part of the kind of much more of this creation and imagination side of the anarchy and abolition conversation in recreating these spaces of autonomy and of freedom and of community, in recreating her father's old bar, which was a beautiful work. And it was also in the Pride Parade, and it became this mobile space for freedom and community and expression. And the ways that she plays with both redaction and this hyper visible presence, I think, is a really important turn in the relation between opacity and visibility when you want to be visible. And so I guess in just kind of bringing these 3 people together in my imagination, I'm really looking forward to the forthcoming conversation and thinking about all of the different ways that we think about the state, that we think about one another, that we think about care, that we think about the related acts of creation and destruction. And with that, I will turn it over to Kēhaulani.
I appreciate being here. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon for those on the West Coast. For my part here today, I want to push on the links between abolition and decolonization. I want to address ongoing settler colonial domination of Indigenous peoples in tandem with the enduring racialized violence that imperils Black lives, what Sadie Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. I come at this from an anarchist political orientation, which is to say anti-capitalist and anti-statist. On the one hand, we have the enduring racial logic that enslavers held about Black people's inferiority throughout the existence of chattel slavery, alongside what Patrick Wolf theorizes as the logic of elimination of the native. We must counter both logics as they manifest, and that I see as the foundation of our interconnected liberation. For Indigenous peoples subject to US authority, there is not yet a post-colonial condition or afterlife of settler colonization. That is to say, the US government continues to prevent Indigenous peoples as collective polities from exercising full self-determination, including reclaiming traditional lands. And that is not simply a structural reality, and that is not just a structural reality, it is enshrined in contemporary law, with Indigenous peoples subordinated by both the doctrine of discovery and the plenary doctrine. As land is the centerpiece of settler colonial dispossession, so too should land be the centerpiece of decolonization. And when I speak of decolonization, I do not mean the return to some primordial, fantastic Eden, as good as that might sound, as if that is even possible. Rather, I'm talking about decolonization as praxis, one that is beyond the state. And that proposal is challenging to many, especially since historically putative decolonization has usually meant the right of colonized peoples to create their own nation states. Drawing on W.E.B. Du Bois's influential text, Black Reconstruction in America, Angela Davis has interpreted and further theorizes his concept of abolition democracy. She connects the abolition of slavery, the death penalty, and of prisons themselves to the possibility of substantive democracy in the United States and globally. As Davis explains, Du Bois argues that a host of democratic institutions are needed to fully achieve abolition, thereby helping to render the prison obsolete. For me, that vision resonates with two distinct social formations: indigenous sovereignty and anarchist praxis. In her book, Mohawk Interruptus, Audra Simpson challenges readers to see that a sovereign entity can exist within another, what she terms nested sovereignty. That is, when indigenous political orders prevail in the present, they do so seemingly paradoxically within and apart from settler governance, as she puts it. This resonates for me with the anarchist maxim, building the new world in the shell of the old, as expressed by the Constitution of the Industrial Workers of the World, which rejects vanguard hierarchical politics in favor of self-organization, direct action, counter-institutions, and participatory democracy. Of course, there are strident debates as to whether or not democracy and the creation of new institutions are compatible with anarchist politics, a tension not easily resolved, one I hope we can talk about in the cross discussion. I suggest that emancipation does not have predefined borders of a political body. Decolonization and abolition are processes that cannot be bounded by progressive politics, a renewed social contract, or simply a more robust liberal democracy. I look to the possibilities that decolonization and abolition afford as forms of resistance that defy the conventional grammar of politics. In closing, I want to highlight the work of Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson in their book, As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation. They speak to the possibilities of Black Indigenous solidarity by highlighting how the political life of white supremacy in the nation is co-implicated with the imposition, development, and maintenance of US settler colonial domination of Native peoples. In their vision of Black liberation, they insist that, quote, the existence of free Black people necessitates a complete transformation and destruction of this settler state, end quote. They go on to argue, quote, the solution to white supremacy is the active rejection of it and the dual affirmation of Indigenous sovereignty and Black humanity, end quote. Mahalo. And now to Eric.
Hello, everybody. It's a big fangirl moment to spend time with these three people. So I'm very much looking forward to this. I also just wanted to thank all the organizers, Rachel, Chloe, Gina, everybody that's put labor into this event. I know there's a lot of behind the scenes invisibilized labor. And so I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that. It seems important. And then also there's two projects that I wanted everybody that's gathered here today to know about. So the first is Abolition May, which is organized by the Cops Off Campus Coalition. And it's a series of events across Turtle Island and beyond, demanding cops off campus and cops off the planet. So that seems like a good place to start. And I think perhaps somebody can drop the link for that. Then the second one, which is more Bay Area centered, is the kind of ongoing struggle on 4th Street or 4th and University Avenue in Berkeley to protect the Ohlone Shell Mound from development. So it's a ongoing and escalating struggle, and people are asking for solidarity action. So hopefully we can also drop the link for that. So I just wanted to start there. And while our goal here tonight is not to debate what constitutes anarchism, right? That's a long, tedious, and pretty boring conversation. However, given that it is so overdetermined, we might want to think a bit about its contours, right? Its tendencies, perhaps. So last year, as we all know, anarchism was living rent-free in Trump's head with his proclamation that anarchist jurisdictions were threatening us all, right around the corner, coming to get us. But that articulation was but a current iteration of a much older practice of particularly targeting anarchist thought and action. We can talk about that later, perhaps. Yet not surprising, liberals too are equally committed to this narration as they continue to suggest, for example, that those that stormed the Capitol in January were anarchist, right? So this bipartisan disdain might also mean that we're winning. So that's maybe something we can talk about. But one place that we might want to think anarchism, and a place that I return to oftentimes, is with the writing of Kwasi Balogun, who was a member of the Black Liberation Army, a political prisoner, one of the Panther 21. He died of AIDS in 1986 in prison. In writing from prison, he said, quote, "The goals of anarchy don't include replacing one ruling class with another, neither in the guise of a fairer boss or as a party," close quote. So anarchism then is recalcitrant to the fantasy of representational democracy, which is to say the terror of the settler state, right? The fairer party model. Anarchism also remains a force, even internal to itself, that sabotages the naturalization of hierarchy. Right? In other words, it's not a scene of randomized, hyper-individuated violence, as Pelosi and Trump might suggest. That's the current system of liberal democracy we are living and dying under. For me, then, anarchism is a practice of being together that proliferates communal joy, right? It's a recursive divestment from the structures of abandonment and violence that currently disallow us from knowing anything other than that. And that might seem abstract, and we can talk about some actual examples of that later as well. So abolitionists, including many gathered here today, have long helped us understand the co-constitutive relationship between police power and the state form, right? This is one of the many gifts that abolition feminism gives us. This is to say, beyond just enforcing the law, policing is fundamentally about enforcing the idea of the law itself. Given this bind between policing, which includes the policing of gender, ability, land, space, and a whole lot more, what would remain of the state if its policing, and more importantly, its policing, is abolished? Or asked another way, how might an anti-colonial anarchist transfeminism be necessary for fashioning an abolitionist way of life? Along with these questions, I want to think about the luscious generativity of anarchism. I want to inhabit its force as an invitation to the abundance of the world. And I think art is necessary to give form to that drive. And so I'm really excited to think with all of you all and turn it over to Sadie.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I always just want to start by thanking those that came before me, on this land, in my profession, my ancestors, my family, and also want to acknowledge this whole series has been amazing and generative and generous, and the Barring Freedom exhibition has been a very powerful honor to participate in, and the conversations that my work is in that exhibition. So I am going to screen share, and I'm going to try to keep this short and just kind of introduce a project to you, and then hopefully we'll be able to revisit some of the themes as we cross chat and cross pollinate these ideas together. So essentially the project that I want to share with you comes from a 500-page surveillance file amassed on my father during his time with the Black Panthers in Southern California, and then a few years later, working with Angela Davis to secure her freedom. And so my family filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011, and after 4.5 years of back and forth with the FBI, we received this 500-page, chilling, terrifying, maddening documentation of, one particular type of documentation of my father's life. And I knew immediately that it was kind of my honor, my duty to reclaim this work and to make this file do something other than what it was intended to do. And so I'm going to quickly show you some of the ways that I've been doing that and how it's changed and what I've been learning. So this first slide that you see is from an exhibition that I did in 2017 and 2018 called Dear 1968. And you can see in the image on the very left, this is my father, family Polaroid blown up to almost life size. He's in an army uniform. And in the next image, he's in what we think of as the Panther uniform. So this really embodies, this thing that we see after every war in the history of the United States, which is that a generation of, at that time, men, Black and brown men, come home from a war where they, lost friends, potentially lost limbs, risked their life, and come home to having no more place in this country than before they left. No more rights, no more seat at the table. And my father talks about feeling like he was still at war because of the police presence in Compton. And so he joins the Black Panthers, and you can see, surrounding this image is a wallpaper created of these stamps from within the dossier. So there's, signatures, date stamps. In the top right corner, you can see this racial intersect. So just really showing how systematized the, racial profiling was. And I think that, sometimes when we hear the word surveillance, we can think that it's this sort of, benign collecting of information, but it is in fact so much more. It's intimidation, it's harassment, fomentation of personal disputes, it's agent provocateurs, it's coercion, blackmail, and even assassination. This is the one image within the entire dossier. Of course, it's a mugshot of my father. And so, we understand that the way a mugshot functions is necessarily to dehumanize somebody, to make them a number, to make them expendable. And so I thought maybe by me actually drawing this mugshot with pencil in my own hand, that I could maybe change it into being like a portrait of a freedom fighter, a portrait of my father, with some humanity. And that leads me to the current work that I'm working on now, which is again using graphite, which is powdered graphite, which is essentially like a powdered, pigment form to make these really large scale drawings. And as I continue to grapple with this, 500-page dossier, I'm really steering the work toward a scale shift and a material shift that really underscores this project is one of restoration and reclamation. Here you can see the pages are tonally inverted. So it's black on white has been flipped, and kind of to try to further transmute it from its original intent. And again, it's powdered graphite on white paper. So what I ask you all that are joining to do, is imagine that these are much bigger than your computer screen. So instead of, staring at like an LCD monitor, these are 48 inches by 60 inches tall. So you have to imagine that you're, standing in a museum and the drawings are taller than you, and you're kind of looking up and processing this information. And the texture of the drawings themselves is very, it's dark, but it also has a type of sheen to it. And there's, some variation to the black, and it's got an almost metallic type of surface to it. One thing you would do if you saw them in person is get really close up to them to try to see that they're really drawings. And I'm also adding roses to these documents. And this is really to honor, to mourn, and memorialize, the families and former members of the party that have been affected and who continue to this day to, not receive any redress. So even as we celebrate, all of these 50th anniversaries, we still have former Panthers locked up, still incarcerated, and families that have, no reparations or repair. So these roses in some kind of, maybe necessarily failing way attempt to bring some healing. And, as I'm sitting there doing these drawings, it's like a type of spell casting almost for repair and justice. And so I'm going to just kind of fly through these, but give you, enough of a sense of what they're looking like. This work is going to be shown in the fall, which will be the first time that, all about 12 of these drawings will be shown together. This page is actually detailing surveillance of the Black Panther newspaper. So the newspaper is being passed around to FBI offices looking, for other folks to surveil. And in a way, it's like the information itself is being policed and surveilled. And there's these Hello Kitties, kind of inserting my authorship, my voice as this kid, kind of retroactively trying to protect her father with like a Hello Kitty People's Army. Here's a detail. And then alongside this work, there's always the family, right? So there's these moments of, the living room, moments of care, of real lives and humanity happening and unfolding with these outer space moments, these glitter, restorative kind of technology moments, using abstraction, glitter, the fantastical to summon other dimensions of human experience and imagination. That's my dad, like contemporary nowadays dad, pointing through the portal. And then I'm just gonna leave here since, Zoe mentioned the Eagle Creek Project, which operates in a really different way, but also honors my father's work and honors his bar, which was the first Black-owned gay bar in San Francisco, and is a working, functioning installation that really allows us to come into community together and not necessarily wait for freedom, wait for abolition, but kind of carve out, fleeting moments of that feeling together in space. So thank you. I will leave it there and rejoin the group.
Okay. Whew. I took a lot of notes and I'm trying to think about where it makes sense to start. I think it makes sense to start at the beginning. So maybe the question is, to kind of get us going, is, each of our projects are very different, but they're all complementary. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of explain, like, lots of tendencies of anarchism, lots of infighting, whatever, lots of external definitions, but what are the greatest kind of animating forces and contours of your personal practices, your artistic practice, your scholarly practice, your indigenous cultural practice, whatever? What are the kind of overarching themes and the kind of motifs that are most salient and precious in your work? Do I call on people? I don't know. I don't want to call on people.
You don't have to call on people. I think, we're all just kind of thinking, and hopefully that's all right. And we'll be doing that together throughout, this hour. But I think some of the themes that are definitely central to me, I was talking to somebody the other day and I said this thing, and as soon as I said it, I realized that it was true. I said, I think some people, it's their job to take care of the future, and some people, it's their job to take care of the past. And I think I do have a really strong tendency to kind of be taking care of the past, creating an archive when I see that there is one missing, or when I see that a story isn't told. And so this act of, telling my father's story has felt kind of like, family work, like familial duty, in the best sense of the way, like taking care of your family in the past tense. So I think that's one thing that's central to my work. And then of course, always dreaming about the future, but allowing it to be slippery enough, and not getting caught up in the fact that we don't know what it looks like, but that's where the potentiality lies. And so using those kind of glitter scapes and glitter fields as a place to project and dream onto.
I can jump in here too. Thank you so much, Sadie. That was incredible. I want to just touch on a couple ways to answer your question, Zoe, in terms of thinking about sort of the immediate and the everyday. And for me, that's about trying to, reorder my own life and work with people around me to have more sustaining and ethical relationships that are not based on proprietary models. And that's some of the work that I've been teasing out in my work on non-statist forms of Hawaiian sovereignty. And here sovereignty is a gloss for a non-Westphalian mode about relationship to land and all living entities, and thinking about, colonial enclosure of land, genders, sexualities in terms of, imposing a proprietary model on all of those and how those are interconnected, and thinking about the relationship between land, gender, and sexuality for a decolonial project in terms of active decolonization that shifts away from that modality of interaction to not just something more, we talk about consent-based politics, and I mean that in the deepest way, but really thinking about that which fosters life, right? And so for me, that is not about a purity politics of a pre-colonial purity or a bid for that, but really thinking about what works best right now in the 21st century that can be informed by those epistemological resources that are grounded in indigenous modes that actually work and serve us right now, and us in the biggest sense of the word. It's a very inclusive model. Not every cultural norm has that. I think, I don't want to generalize. I'm looking at Hawaiian models in terms of thinking about inclusivity that's grounded in a Hawaiian indigeneity that's very inclusive, historically, sometimes to our own detriment, because we're working within a reciprocal kind of norm, and when there's not a reciprocal on the other end. The other thing I might just touch upon, and this I think links back to Eric, you starting off with grounding yourself right in the cops off campus and the shell mound struggle, is thinking about our relationship to indigeneity and indigenous sovereignty from our immediate locale. And for me, living 5,000 miles away from the Hawaiian Islands, Kaipai Aina o Hawaii, I'm here in Mattabesset, the traditional homeland of the Wangang people, and have been engaged in a long-term, very slow, painstaking project called Decolonizing Indigenous Middletown, here in Middletown, Connecticut, and trying to really work against that logic of elimination that has rendered the Wangang people completely invisible and extinct, which is just a farce. And so what does that mean in terms of not just, an empty land acknowledgement as some liberal gesture, but actually trying to lift up the survivance of the Wangang families that are still here in place in their traditional homeland. And I know that there's a far-flung diaspora that, is refugees basically who have folded into other tribes. So those are the things that I think of sort of as an initial response to your question.
Oh, and I guess for me, it's like, to me, right, study and struggle always come together, and organizing, being in the messy, beautiful collectivity of the world is how I've learned anything that I've ever known, and I think that's always really important to return to, especially as we become more and more hyper-professionalized, right? It's like, I learned about kind of like the actual practice of anarchist or anti-hierarchical organizing vis-a-vis my work with ACT UP, right? It didn't really have the same name then, but it was like, oh, that's how I learned how to think about consensus. That's how I learned to think about what does it mean to have a group, have a leader or not have a leader, or have work anonymously or not anonymously, or how to think about figure, all that kind of really practical knowledge. And then that really informed, later quote unquote academic work that I did, right? So, sometimes it's interesting to go back and think if Lenin is wrong about the state, but then also I just want us all to figure out how to get each other free and stay in that freedom. That's fundamentally what it is about for me. And so it's always a kind of oscillation that, organizing keeps me accountable to in a way that it also is always a gift to me, because it's like a gift of collective education that I don't get anywhere else. And so to me, that's kind of both my place of departure and my arrival.
And I guess if I'm going to answer my own question, I think a lot about this really complicated twinned relationship between self-determination and dispossession, and the different scales at which it exists. So in Arkansas, they just vetoed the governor's downvote of this bill that would take affirming healthcare away from trans kids, right? So I think about that kind of self-determination as a simultaneously individualized experience and a collectivized experience within which we're all living in this regime of like gendered ordering and the forced socialization and gender, the non-permission of gender expansiveness as intimately related to settler colonization, right? And, the enforcement of gender on Indigenous people when, Christian European settlers arrived in places all across the world. And so it's thinking about what is the relationship between individual autonomy and a kind of collective self-determination. And I guess because of the work that I do, I think about that a lot through medicine and the very, medical materials and resources that are super easy for some people to access to do whatever they need to do are becoming increasingly impossible for others to access. Even in this pandemic moment, when we're all supposed to be accessing certain things, and there are all of these mechanisms in place that are enabling life for others and deliberately depriving life from others. So I think about that tension and the kind of scalarity of those two concepts. And I wonder, I'm thinking about, what Eric was saying about autonomous jurisdictions and the threat that autonomous jurisdictions pose to fascists, the right and the left, to liberals alike. And there's something about individual self-determination, even. Not that I think that gender is an individual phenomenon, it's not. But there's something about like gender, for example, that like really, really rankles so-called progressives, like, certain kinds of feminists, as well as the right, that has always been very adamant about organizing gender. And I don't know, I don't think the horseshoe effect is real, but there's also something that's so fascinating about liberals and fascists being actually united in this fear of anarchy and undermining of the state.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, like, and then it's like, what do those zones, what do those spaces, like, what do they reference, right? In a certain sense, they, they serve as a kind of reference point to the kind of already living reality that the world could be otherwise, right? That's one of the promises that they give us, with all the messy hardness that they come along with, right? They're not like utopian, they're just about like being in the moment, being in the muck in a certain kind of sense. And so, yeah, but there's something about that particular figure of, self, which is also to say collective. Like, I think that's what you're saying is always really important, because to me, self-determination always lives within a kind of collectivity. Otherwise, it's just like, scary libertarianism. But so, that distinction is also important. But the kind of self-determination that lives in the collectivity is so terrorizing to the idea of the state, right? And we also then are made abundantly aware of the ways in which, fascism is reliant upon the state form in the same way that the Democratic Party is reliant on the state form, right? And so I think that that's one of the moments. And so that's why that, like, the jurisdiction question, right? And the idea as if anarchists were storming the Capitol with covered in American flag, you know what I mean? Like that whole scene, and you're like, what are y'all talking about? Right? But it becomes this kind of, a specter, and this is all really right from the 1800s in this context at least, right? It's a really long kind of figure, like the figure of the anarchist as that thing that liberal democracy cannot kind of consume.
Mm. And I think there's something about that unconsumability that makes me think about and thinking about scales again, that brings me back to Sadie's work, right? About like it inhabits like so many sizes and so many spaces, right? There's the quiet of the archive and the really quiet critical work of pouring through the archive and thinking about what we can use in order to kind of refuse the terroristic intimidation that surveillance is intending, like the kind of affect that surveillance intends. So I guess I'm thinking about this individual collectivity in your work, Sadie, and how you kind of think about the boundaries of yourself and your family and your community and the broader, wider international struggle.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the more specific or the more personal, the more universal in terms of storytelling. And so there is a very particular element of like, this is me talking about my father. But I also, share his story not because it's unique, but actually because it's extremely ubiquitous. Like, it wasn't just, the Panthers that were under surveillance, right? Like the NAACP was under FBI surveillance since 1923. There was a moment where every Black student at Swarthmore was under surveillance. Under J. Edgar Hoover, FBI agents were required to have, every FBI agent was required to have at least one Black informant. And in DC, FBI agents were required to have 6 Black informants. So, a lot of times when I'm doing these talks, I'm like, it wasn't just my father that was under surveillance. A lot of y'all's fathers was under surveillance as well. And so, I'm telling this story with what I know and what has arrived in my life, because that feels like what I'm best suited to do. I'm not an academic per se. I'm not an expert, on like the history of surveillance or, political structures. However, I know deeply in my bones that another world is possible. I just know that has to be true. And so, with all of the love and care and kind of fiercely protective, love that I bring to my family, I feel like that has to be brought to the world, has to be brought to, imagining another way of engaging with each other and engaging with this land and engaging with resources, and just to kind of throw my 2 cents in terms of when I think about abolition and the world that I'm imagining. It's not just like, okay, well, J. Edgar Hoover was a bad director of the FBI and we need to get a good director of the FBI, right? Like I am imagining all of our priorities are so reoriented that like, no one wants to be the richest man in the world. Like that's not success. That's not considered successful anymore. Something that I learned from my very introductory studies into like Ohlone traditions was that wealth was measured by how much you share. And so perhaps, somebody like Jeff Bezos is actually not like the richest, winningest man in the world, but is actually just like a hoarder who's screwing up, the kind of like dignity and flow of our entire society, and thinking, about, not only dismantling the criminal justice system, but also like decommodifying housing. And, how much sense does it make that you only get a place to live if you have money? Like, I'm dreaming of a world where we look back on this time and all of those things seem crazy to us. And, those future people will kind of wonder what we were thinking, and hopefully they'll have compassion and realize that we didn't want to condone this system. But here we are struggling to, find the other ways of thinking about it. So, this is a lot of like threads going in different directions, but I feel like, this conversation can kind of handle that. And so those are the things that I'm thinking about literally when I'm like drawing these flowers on these state surveillance documents that were attempting to, undo and discredit my father and the movement. And of course, connecting it to activists today and the surveillance that they're under and the, capabilities of digital surveillance. And so all of that is kind of wrapped into these objects that I'm making because that's the language that I have.
And this idea of abolition as this moral reordering and reprioritization, right? Like that's what I hear coming out of your work, Kēhaulani, where you are thinking about these like trans-spatial indigenous sovereignties, right? Like you're thinking about the Hawaiian Islands, and you're also thinking about New England. And you're thinking, and you're rooted in these values of relations to land, of relations to indigeneity, of relations to one another, and these different communalisms, not as a kind of like, stamping a single template into all of these different contexts and locations, but kind of having a particular set of values and a particular set of orientations and seeing how they're applicable in each of these places.
Right. And that's really about, rethinking a new way of relationality and being in right relationship to the people of the land wherever we are. I wanted to just briefly touch on that question around the individual and the collective that you started out talking about, the self-determination piece, and that relationship between individual autonomy and the collective self. I'm teaching a class that I've taught several times at Wesleyan. It's on this semester called Anarchy in America, From Haymarket to Black Lives Matter. And it's that question of the individual in relation to the collective that tends to be one of the key kinds of tensions in the class, which hasn't really come up this semester yet. And it might just be where we are in the material. It tends to be around that question and the question of violence or nonviolence, and where people stand on preemptive self-defense in terms of the question of violence. And then, the kind of age-old kind of debates around the nature of the human, good or bad, and sort of what for many people is a deal breaker around anarchism of like, do the people think people are inherently good, or that they're inherently going to screw other people over? So, just thinking about those in tension with each other, but also that question of the individual and the collective. And I'm thinking, just to go back to your example about the medical care for trans youth, and thinking about how anarchism and sovereignty and indigeneity and coloniality kind of reframes the question of medicine. Eric, I remember Queer Nation in the Bay Area when I was cutting my political teeth. I'd be a rank and file, go to whatever demo and show up. But in terms of my own sort of point of entry into what I would consider an anarchist politic, really came about through DIY, what we called back then in the late 80s, early 90s as self-help healthcare. And that had to do with really learning enough medical technology for everything from cervical exams and pelvic exams to learning how to do menstrual extraction. And, part of that was about the individual self-empowerment to know bodies that have those anatomies and actually learn about them and actually learn how to practice that on other people who are willing to let you do that. But also in the context and political climate where we thought, reproductive rights were completely going to be obliterated under the first Bush regime, and thinking about the question of the law and abortion access, for example, and what one needs to know to do that. But then again, that tension between an individual kind of privilege to learn those things, but also the broader circles of empowerment of what it means to do that in groups and build trust and build community and build that kind of vulnerability around skill set sharing, and then not lose sight of the bigger structural forces and not to have it all dwindle down into those individual spaces, which are taking places in homes, people's living rooms, but, thinking beyond that, but starting in that immediate sense. And I'm thinking about that right now around community care and self-care, right? And thinking about mutual aid in this, the height of the COVID pandemic. So just some of those things for me are still bearing out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think with regards to the pandemic, what Sadie said about honoring the simultaneous, like honoring, mourning, and memorializing. There's something about the kind of relentlessness of fascism, about the relentlessness of the pandemic that just doesn't allow us to come up for air, to pause, to mourn outside of the kind of weird empty gesture of like 500,000 candles that you stand in front of quietly, but like don't seem to do anything really to kind of ramp up people's access or to make accommodations for people not having access to care. Which makes me think a lot about how in these moments we are able to express, are able to offer care, are able to create art that forces you to think, forces you to feel, to feel again, to feel stronger, to feel harder, to feel more. And I guess a part of abolition is a kind of, I hate this word, but like resilience building. Not in this way of being better able to withstand harm, right? Because that is bullshit, but better able to withstand the stresses that are made on the bonds that we are attempting to make with one another. It wasn't really a question, but I'm just thinking a lot about those bonds and about those togetherness, because something that I think I've seen a lot is people being like, I worry that my social bonds will not withstand this going on another year. And so just thinking, about abolition as a growing of interdependence. Yeah. And thinking about kind of queer socialities, indigenous sovereignties, Black movements and interracial movements as not things to necessarily repeat wholesale, but as these like really strong models of offering care, despite even the stressors that came upon them historically.
Yes.
I think one thing that I can speak to from that, Zoe, just like the value of life, right? Like I think that during this pandemic, or this more visible pandemic, I think personally one of the reasons why the murder of George Floyd hit us so hard and so deeply in our hearts is because we were in this moment where everybody was fighting for life, like wear a mask to protect lives, don't see your family to protect lives, like don't go to work, don't leave your house, don't do any of these things because we want to protect each other's lives, because we care, about life, and at the most basic fundamental just level, like literally being for the existence of life and breath. And so to watch this police officer, to watch the state, literally extinguish a life and a soul in this moment where everyone's fighting to, keep people alive. I think that was just like such a gut-wrenching, kind of, for some people awakening, and for some people a confirmation of the fact that like the state actually doesn't support life. Like this isn't living, and this isn't sustainable. These extractive economies, this imperialism, like this is all about death. And I think that, that whether it's the connections between each other, that's life, and like the breath in your body, that's life. And I think that's that element of, abolition in the way that I'm imagining and thinking and dreaming, that is like this additive, positive, blooming, blossoming thing, and also fun and joyful, because there's going to be a lot of like weird, cool stuff that people can do when we're sitting in these positions of freedom. You know, like it's probably going to be a little freaky and a lot more creative when life really gets to flourish and blossom on this planet.
Sadie, I really love your kind of constant reframing of the party. You know what I mean? Like the joy of the party, because I think that that's really important, right? And that's something that lots of people do around abolition. And I think that that's really important, right? The question is not, can we, you know, live without the state? It's, can we live with the state, right? And so, you know, what would it mean to take that kind of, you know, abolition as invitation also to anarchism, right? I think that that's something that anarchists haven't done so well, right? But I think it is equally as fitting, right? Because the kind of collective flourishing that you're so beautifully naming, you know, to me, it kind of extends outward to both of those scenes, right? And so, I don't know, I just really appreciate that, because I think that that is actually, I mean, that's how I actually think about it, and that's how we actually live it, right? It's not, I don't know, it's like, I'm not scared of the apocalypse of the, you know, end of the state. I'm scared of the apocalypse of the state. So.
And I mean, the concept of like the party and the celebration is so much of what queer life is oriented around, right? About, yeah, about this kind of freedom of expression. And part of that freedom being joy, because joy is not something that is always, you know, in the past, I've definitely been like a skeptic of like, well, Black joy, like, I don't know. But I guess it took a pandemic to recognize like, no, like that's, it's very important to have these spaces of, I guess we can't do it at the moment, but of this gathering, of embrace, of celebration, of this resilience, of this survival, and the simultaneity of those things and this mourning and memorialization. Yeah.
To be able to hold that, all of that.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, it is that joy that allows, you know, to go back to what you said earlier, Eric, the reality and the reminder of the world already being already otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
The thing for me that's the most beautiful thing about anarchism is that we practice it constantly, and we don't call it anarchism. You know, like meal trains and taking care of each other's children and all of these different kinds of mutual aids that pop up in different cultures around the world, and all kinds of different sovereignties and self-determinations that might not exist on these mass collective levels, but do exist on some scale.
I think that's the part about the praxis, right? Is that's the experimentation, and that's where play can come in as well as joy, right? Because you're testing different things out to see what works, and negotiating that with people who want to be in concert in certain ways, and thinking about different scales of possibility. So, I mean, I think that can be really exciting and also can be terrifying.
I think, if I don't want to interrupt anyone, do we want to start answering a couple of questions?
Yeah, I see a couple here.
Okay.
Including from Donna.
Yes.
Aloha, Donna.
So Donna says, my question comes from working with immigrant individuals and communities in Santa Cruz now, and also from the complex history of immigration, the state, racial capitalism, and so much more in founding and perpetuating the US. I don't know how to tie the concepts of settler colonialism to current and past questions about immigration in specific places, including Hawaii. I think part of the approach we need is through communitarian anarchism informed by abolition, indigenous land struggles, and more. How do we think about immigration in the context of current foregrounding of Black and indigenous histories and generative politics?
Mhm. If I can jump in at least just to initially respond to that, thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. I can't see you, but maybe later. The thing that comes to mind immediately is the ways in which settler colonial structures sort of conscript people into forms of nativism to take the place of indigenous peoples. And that can be just on the everyday level of people calling themselves native New Yorkers, or people who are saying he's, a native Minnesotan or a native Californian, and all the ways that disappear indigenous peoples. And then it leaks into those questions around immigration of who thinks they own the place and who thinks that they get to control the borders, and sort of thinking about the violence of those borders and how militarized they are. And so, I think that's where, for me, indigeneity as an analytical category is really useful, where people don't usually think about indigeneity in relation to immigration. And, that can be everything from the borders that bifurcate tribal nations that are on those borders, but that idea of who thinks they own the place and who's asserting themselves as the people to control the land or own the land. And that can also include people of color, can be part of that, we know. But, one of the activist sort of networking or practices that comes to mind, and there are some examples on this side of the border of, I'm thinking of on the Canadian side, or the colonial side of the medicine line on that end up north, is No One Is Illegal, which is a network across North America. And I know about, there are chapters all over, but I came to understand that work through Harsha Walia, who I believe is still based in Vancouver. And the slogan of No One Is Illegal is "No one is illegal, Canada is illegal." And it really is about a broader sort of mobilization and collective education to acquaint people who are, enduring issues of asylum seekers, war refugees, migrant justice, immigration politics, to acquaint them with the people of the land where they actually are, and actually that kind of embodied sovereignty of recognizing the people of the land in the everyday. And it may not stop somebody from immediately being deported, but it is changing the sort of social world in terms of who people look to, and what's the immediate point of reference. And so I think that can reconfigure the way things go, because we can point to the government doing this, but until I think we start really changing our everyday ways as people and how we interact with the people of the land wherever we actually are, the people indigenous to the lands that we're on. And that isn't always going to line up. There are tribes that are actually participating in some of the border control policing, like in the Southwest. But again, a lot of that, when you kind of peel back the layers, is a structural constraint around a political economy where people don't have an income, and there's survival economics. So, I think about that as an initial piece, Donna, in terms of immigration in the context of settler colonialism and, sort of a liberatory racial politics. And also want to mention the work of Monisha Dasgupta, who's a colleague at University of Hawaii at Manoa, who's a sociologist in ethnic studies, who's writing a book on migrant justice that doesn't ditch the indigenous piece in terms of that for all of the case studies. And that book is coming soon. I don't know that it's in press yet, but that's something to track. Again, that's Monisha Dasgupta. So those are just some initial thoughts on that.
I don't have a full answer, but I do know that when William and I were writing As Black as Resistance, and when we were trying to think about Blackness and land, one of the in kind of this thinking about nativism and proprietary relations to land, is to be really conscious about Black land politics that don't replicate settler imaginaries. He is much more well-versed in like Black ecologies and some of these kind of land stewardship politics than I am. But we were thinking about some of these kind of like reparative imaginaries where they would get like former Confederate states And, we're thinking like, well, what happens to these peoples in the South? What happens to the sovereignties of these peoples in the South? And I've heard people be like, well, they can be citizens of our state, but it's like they are already citizens of their own nations. So why, in the name of freedom, are we like re-assimilating them into this other national structure that may not be complementary to ones that have pre-existed? So just being really conscious about, yeah, exactly this nativism, this sense of ownership, this tendency to want to compete, because when you're claiming a nativism, right, there's no kind of complementing one another. A person is native. There's a particular claim that we have to nativism within the kind of Westphalian state, where it's like, if I am native to this thing and you are not me, or you are not in my kind of collectivity, like you are not. And we want to kind of think about, we want to think about identities and relations that are not this kind of competition, that are not displacing, that are, I think one thing, Eric or Sadie, did you want to say something? I think one thing that we didn't do at the beginning that I think we said we were going to do is define how we are understanding the state. Because I don't think, I think that the state TM can be a lot of things. And I think that the nebulousness of what the state is, or what the nation is, like what is the state, a nation, and a nation state? Like how are we kind of thinking about and operationalizing the idea of a state?
I can't do that, but I can say a few things that I think about it. I mean, to me, the state is both a kind of structuring apparatus, which is different than structural, right? Because it's constantly reproducing itself. And that is to say, it kind of collects up as a kind of group projection, right? So to me, the state actually isn't something external to all of us, right? It's all of our collective projections, right? And so that's what makes it actually so nebulous and so dangerous, right? Because it's not just a thing that's over there that needs to be overthrown, right? It is in certain senses that thing, but it is reinvented all the time by all kinds of things, you know what I mean? So I think that kind of tension is important to me when I'm thinking about the state, right? So it doesn't just become something external that none of us have any kind of accountability for reproducing, right? In the same way that we might think about the logics of policing that we're constantly reproducing vis-a-vis our relationships. We're doing the same thing, I think, with the state form.
From kill the cop in your head to kill the state in your head? Or kill the state in other people's heads? No.
I mean, that's how I was thinking about it too. It's this kind of like structural, external, and the ways that we internalize these like disciplinary logics and then enforce them. Yeah, I don't really have a working definition of the state, but what you said, Eric, is I think that's good for me too.
I as well will not attempt to define it, but just to add on to that, also the ways in which we, participate in order to survive, right? Like the ways in which we're kind of cornered into being, a part of the system, whether you're being, beaten up by the cops, or whether I have family members who are cops. People need jobs for reasons, that many things in your life might lead you toward a moment. These are also the same people who, when you're not wearing that uniform, you're a Black cop, you're still getting harassed by the cops. So it's not that there's like an us and them, and people are not multiple things at one time engaging with the system in multiple, ways. I think about like the informants who were implicated, when I'm spending time with this FBI file, what kind of like leverage and thumb is being held upon these people who are kind of like, state actors in a way, but also because of very real circumstances in their own lives are vulnerable to this type of manipulation. And so I think it's, important not to sound like we somehow exist outside of it or above it in some type of theoretical way, especially I know for myself, it's like my life is full of contradictions. So I'm like, the other day was listening to like one of the Visualizing Abolition, lectures and thinking about like, this anti-capitalism, like, reframing, but I'm also like scrolling on my phone on like a shopping app. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is the reality of being a complicated, complex person who's learning and unlearning all of these things, but also never, separating myself from the reality of like our current moment, which I think it's actually really important to be a part of. Not that it's really an option not to be, but it's important to name it.
I think, so the next question, I appreciate the work of Sadie Barnette in relation to historical documents. The work reminds me of work by Glenn Ligon, Jenny Holzer, Renee Green, and others. Can you say more not only about the effects of the scale shift, but also the conceptual shift in moving government documents and archival histories into the space of art exhibition as a form of visual activism?
I can try, and Zoe, if you have anything to add, feel free. But I think that art is just the language that I have available to me. I think there would be multiple ways to do this project. If I was a writer, I would like to write, the book of my dad's life in a way that I think could maybe move into more spaces than art spaces tend to, maybe not be like the most accessible venue for culture to be disseminated, or like, even film, I think sometimes has a wider audience, but through and through, who I am is just a person who makes pictures and thinks in pictures, and words often fail me. I'm dyslexic. Like, school and all the time that I spent in institutions has always been extremely challenging for me, but I find a kind of adept way of talking about all these really complicated, confusing things in something as simple as the imagery that I'm given to work with. And so I think for me, it has to be art, and these are the spaces that it kind of exists in the best format for. And I think there's also an element of it that's kind of trying to maybe like infiltrate a little bit into the archives of these museums. And so thinking about like, getting my father's story to be, in some flat file at the Guggenheim, for somebody 100 years from now to discover is important to me. So I think it's, even while we think about potentially dismantling the systems that we have, I also like to think about kind of like infiltrating and creeping in, and like when does it work, when does it not? And also just bringing my family into those spaces. I should say like my family, especially my father, my mother, they're active participants in this work. So whenever there's an opening, of this work, all of my family is there. And kind of like, I think, some people think maybe it's like a performance activation of the work, but it's just my family, being together and supporting me and being proud of me. But I always, kind of like how we change those spaces just by being together in them.
So great. And that was Jennifer Gonzalez asking that question. Aloha, Jennifer.
And to just say one thing about Sadie's art, as the wannabe unofficial historian of her work, the thing that I think is the most interesting and that I love the most about her work is that it offers a counter to like the official history or the official archive. And it's a kind of it's not that anyone can do what she does, but it is a demonstration of archive making that that shows that archives exist outside of the official archives that are assigned, that are placed into institutions, and that are then like propagated as histories, that we can contest the history, and that we can also insert ourselves into the history, right? Just as the state is not something that exists far away, the archive and the historical moment is not something that we exist outside of. And the way that she kind of methodically places herself and her family and communities and other families like into her work, I think is a really beautiful and important component of it. So, I think we wanted, there's a question, does anyone know of any studies or work about incarceration and policing during the pandemic? Like, has policing become more or less violent? And are there moments about policing within the pandemic and resistances to policing within the pandemic that can further our abolitionist politics? I think I'll try to answer. I think that one of the things that started ringing alarm bells to everybody who studies fascism is at the very beginning of the pandemic, when all of these different states, particularly states that have right-wing governments, started enacting emergency powers. And historically, we've seen emergency powers kind of dovetail into the broadening and the centralization of state power, and the construction of a strong fascist state. And I think it's been alarming to see how that has kind of played out, and the ways that, I mean, I don't know if there's been more policing, but we've seen the same pattern, like racialized and classed patterns of policing within a pandemic specific context, like the people who get arrested most often for like mask infractions or breaking curfews or whatever, like follow broad trends of, representation in prisons and other carceral institutions. So I think the lesson to learn is that, the prison industrial complex never sleeps. And when there's emergency, it sleeps even less.
Maybe I could just add something else. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think another important part is, right, the kind of massive, right, prison itself is always a death machine, literally, but the ways in which COVID has been specifically propagated in prisons, under the direction of murdering people in prisons, right? We that always has to be part of our conversation. So I think that that's really important. So thinking about the ways in which COVID is so rampant in prisons and has killed so many people, we can't let go of that. And I think just to kind of connect to what you were just saying, I think that the issues of, for example, in San Francisco, we were living under curfew for like 2 months, right? And it was in a lot of, hyper democratically run cities that this happened. And it was interesting because it's the first time in my lifetime that we've lived under curfew for that long, right? You couldn't go out after 10 p.m. as if COVID happens more after 10 p.m. or something like that. And it was fascinating the way in which myself and all of us just like did it. You know what I mean? People that had the luxury of having housing mostly did it, right? And so like, I don't know, it was an interesting time of self-reflection when you're like, oh, wow, what would it mean to live under a state-sanctioned curfew? We would all be resisting. And then everybody, there we were.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add to the chat box. Gina Dent is reminding that the Barring Freedom website has some work from Sharon Daniel regarding COVID in terms of incarceration politics. I just added that link to the page. And also, if I may be so bold, because earlier we were talking about nation state, self-determination. I'm just going to pop in the chat box a very short essay that I had published recently on disentangling nation and peoplehood from statist nationalism. And so it's a very short essay that people might find useful for thinking through some of these. I'll download that in a moment.
Thank you. Looking forward to reading that. Our next and maybe our last question is from Christian. It's asking about the ways that Kēhaulani and Sadie alluded to how coercive practices such as racial capitalism, they create logics of nationalism and they end up creating entanglements with the state, such as nationalistic desire, and perhaps more complexly, willingness to partake in imperial practices like the police and the military. Because the reasons that these desires come forward are so coercive by definition, how do we make praxis of anarchism more attractive while attending to the political economy of constrained choices without reinscribing class logics of who has good politics? And without becoming also like right-wing libertarians.
Right. And that's Christian Hossam, Wesleyan alum. Working on the PhD at Berkeley now. Aloha, Christian. But now to answer that. Think about that.
I feel like part of it has to do with like the rejection of like individual act. Like I just remember reading about like choice feminism and being like, just because you are a self-proclaimed feminist, like doing something, it like doesn't make it feminist, TM, whatever that means. Not and just kind of similarly not being so narrow, and to recognize that like the ways that we conceptualize freedom in as this kind of like projected condition, like we are currently living within various stages of freedom, that we have differing levels of agency because of the class positions and racialized positions and positions of gender and physical ability and whatever. And that like we can, while not being kind of condemnatory and judgmental, like recognize that within positions of constraint, I mean, as Sadie was talking about with, what's the word? Informants, that people are because of the way that the state nurtures deprivation, the state nurtures dependency upon it. And so to think about individual choices and decisions within that context of like the state exists to maintain its own existence. And so it will do everything it can do to maintain its own existence, including like manufacturing consent for its existence and forcing people to be dependent upon it. I think that's what is most kind of fair to me.
Yeah, that's the work of anti-normalization, right? And also creating the alternatives to turn away from the state, I think.
And I think maybe, oh, sorry, Kēhaulani, were you still talking?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. Zoom. Yeah, I mean, I think, I always return for myself that under, the conditions of racial capitalism that we're all living and dying under differently, all we have are bad and worse choices. So if we begin there, then we can open up really differently. And to me, art, incredibly expansively understood, right? In galleries, outside of galleries, all kinds of things, is one of the really important, invitations for imagining, which is to say already living different realities and different social relations, right? Different forms of relationality that are not embedded through, the hierarchy of the state form, which is to say the police state itself, right? And so I think that that's why, cultural production in a very expansive understanding is so important to our movements. And, anarchism hasn't always been the best about that, but we do know how to make things look tortured and boring. But I think making things look beautiful and enjoyable is one of the things we need to do more of.
Yeah.
Sadie, last comments?
I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I think the most the truest thing that I can do is just to share my story, which, as I've said, is many other people's story as well, but share it from, you know, my position. And I am always just, you know, floored and surprised and humbled when, you know, people such as yourselves who have dedicated, you know, your life and scholarship to, like, you know, doing this work in a real way, see, you know, some glimmer or example or prospects in my work. You know, that to me is when I feel like the conversation has come full circle, and like there's work for everyone to do, you know, whoever you are, wherever you are, even if you're just like, you know, a weird art girl.
I just want to thank you all so much, Kēhaulani, Eric, and Sadie, for this conversation. And I know that I'm gonna think about all of the things for a very, very long time. And so I just want to bring back Gina.
And thank you, Zoe, and thank you to the organizers and for the invitation. Mahalo.
I just want to thank you so much on behalf of all of the Visualizing Abolition organizers for such a rich discussion tonight, which really opened onto questions that I think are often very abstract for people about what we're talking about when we're talking about the state, and being able to think beyond the state and understand that, as Eric so beautifully put it, that it's not really out there, is, I think, so helpful for our project and for visualizing a free future. So thank you all for the beautiful work tonight. As a gift and a thank you to our audience and to all of you, we always close with a video from our Music for Abolition series. And tonight, that video comes from Elena Ayodele Pinderhughes and Samora Abayoni Pinderhughes. And the title of their song is Holding Cell. And they wrote, "Cages are no place for any being. Abolish prisons, abolish ICE, abolish borders." Please enjoy. Thank you and good night.
She's still so sure that you won't let her down. Sings as she prays for you. What a sound! Oh, that she made it through. How to tell I can't get well while you hold me. I've been through more than you could imagine in 20 birthdays. I want a quiet life in a flat with church on a Sunday. I got a voice and I got a laugh and I'll use it one day. For now, please just hear me out. I am speaking through bars and writing your cards and keeping count. I know God, He won't leave me. I'm rich with patience, all amounts. Till that moment I'm free, then I keep on waiting till they count me. How to tell I can't get well while you hold me. Still lonely, cold things.